In April of this year, thanks to some truly gonzo reporting in the Washington Post, we learned that Erik Prince, the former chief of Blackwater, the brother of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, we learned that Erik Prince, of all people, took a meeting with a representative of Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Seychelles Islands. It was a meeting organized by the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates. The idea was that the Crown Prince, for some reason, whatever reason, he wanted to facilitate contact between the Trump campaign and Vladimir Putin. And the way he did it was by bringing in Putin's emissary on the one hand and Erik Prince on the other. And he held this meeting in this remote island location so they could synchronize their watches or whatever during the presidential transition. Now, the meeting reportedly happened in December. It was reported in the Washington Post in April. Erik Prince has since acknowledged that the meeting did take place and the Washington Post was right. But he's downplayed the significance of the meeting. He's described the whole purpose of those discussions, the whole purpose of him being in the Seychelles Islands, as just business. Well, we have since learned that one business proposition Erik Prince has been selling is that the U.S. government should pay him $10 billion a year so that he can run the war in Afghanistan as a private for-profit enterprise instead of as a U.S. military action. Erik Prince has done a handful of interviews on this subject. He's very proud of the idea. He has cited colonial rule under the British Empire as the model for how he thinks his private army and private air force should conduct the next X years of the Afghanistan war. The idea of the education secretary's billionaire brother being installed as a self-styled viceroy in Afghanistan to be paid billions of dollars a year by the taxpayers to run his own private war there, it's enough to curl your eyelashes, right? It's hard to believe that would ever be taken seriously outside of Hollywood. I mean, the news reports about Erik Prince making this proposal, they've generally taken the tone that this idea is not really being seriously considered by the Trump administration. Honestly, that reporting has been offered in the same non-specific spirit in which we all keep getting reassured that there are real adults in charge somewhere behind the scenes in this administration and that, therefore, nothing too terrible will happen. Forgive my skepticism. James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, was recently asked about Erik Prince's big business plan to take over the war from the U.S. military. And although we keep hearing that Secretary Mattis is one of those adults who won't let anything too weird happen, he didn't exactly sound dismissive of the idea when he was asked about it.
Mr. Secretary, does the Afghanistan strategy at this point contain any provisions for a significant number of contracted security forces or private? There's been a public discussion about significant increases like 5,000, 5,500 contracted security forces, 90 fleet private air force.
The strategic decision have not been made. It's part of the options being considered, and the president's open to the advice of the Secretary of State and myself and the Director of CIA.
It's part of the options being considered, he says. What at this point is too crazy to imagine? That the president might threaten to rain fire and fury and power like the world has never seen on North Korea? That the president might endorse a rally by white supremacists and neo-Nazis and describe them as not bad people? Is it even more inconceivable than that stuff? That the president might say the war in Afghanistan will now be run by this guy Erik from here on out? The reason, at least the stated reason, that Vice President Mike Pence is having to come home early from his overseas trip tonight is because of a meeting that's just been called to discuss Afghanistan strategy tomorrow at Camp David. That meeting will involve the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the President, and the Vice President. We shall see what comes out of that meeting. Mike Pence was also supposed to do a bunch of Republican Party events and fundraisers this weekend in Virginia. Those events have been canceled. So again, we will see what comes out of this Afghanistan meeting. I don't think it's unreasonable to brace for some truly bizarre news on that subject. But if something like that is going to happen, if something like that is going to get announced, it's worth considering that this is a particularly difficult, challenging, in some ways strange time for the U.S. military. Partly this is a difficult time for the U.S. military because we are at war. And the military bears the entire brunt of that while the civilian world pays very little attention to it here at home. Today, we learned that an Army Green Beret was killed and 11 Utah National Guardsmen were wounded in eastern Afghanistan. The young man who died has been identified by his family as 27-year-old Green Beret Aaron Butler. He's from Monticello, Utah. He was a championship high school wrestler. He was the 7th of 8 kids in his family. He was one of 7 brothers. His family says he signed up for the Utah National Guard while he was still in high school, which means even if he signed up 10 years ago, doing the math, that means the United States was already many years into the Afghanistan war when Sergeant Butler enlisted to serve in the war that eventually took his life. So the news of his death, those other 11 Utah National Guardsmen all being hurt in the same incident, that is huge and very sad news in Utah tonight, in the National Guard, in the community of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. The U.S. Navy was also rocked tonight by the publication of the Navy's first investigative report into that bizarre crash between a U.S. Navy destroyer and a Japanese cargo vessel back in June, just off the coast of Japan. This is a devastating report. It describes in detail and at length how the sailors on board that destroyer fought for their own lives and fought to save each other when those two ships collided in the middle of the night. The efforts to save each other included heroic efforts to save the captain of the ship. The report describes how 5 sailors used a sledgehammer and a kettlebell from the ship's gym to smash their way into the destroyed stateroom of the ship's captain. The ship's captain, his stateroom, basically took a direct hit in that crash with the cargo ship. The sailors who were trying to save him, they did get in. The ship's captain, according to the report, was hanging off the outside of the ship for his life by the time they smashed their way into him to save his life. And those sailors were able to save him, but he will now lose his career in the Navy. The commander of the ship is being relieved of command, as will the commander who was his second in command on board, as will the command master chief, who was the senior enlisted sailor on board. 7 U.S. sailors died in that crash. Apparently, the Navy has not yet determined the overall question of why the crash happened and which of the 2 ships was at fault. But without waiting for that final conclusion, they say they already know enough to fire all the top leadership of that U.S. Navy destroyer. So that is very serious news in the Navy. They're taking very dramatic action. And it can't help in a stressful and high-stakes time like this that all the branches of the military are also this week facing a new unnecessary crisis that was created out of thin air by the U.S. president. A crisis in which all the chiefs of all the branches of the U.S. military have felt the need to break with their long-standing strict practice of avoiding politics. All of the service chiefs this week have felt compelled to put out public statements bluntly disagreeing with, bluntly departing from statements made by the president on race after the Charlottesville rioting this weekend. The Navy Chief of Operations was first to respond this past weekend, saying, quote, "Events in Charlottesville are unacceptable and mustn't be tolerated. U.S. Navy forever stands against intolerance and hatred." That was followed soon thereafter by the Commandant of the Marine Corps, saying there's no place for racial hatred or extremism in the U.S. Marine Corps. That was followed by the Chief of Staff of the Army, saying the Army does not tolerate racism, extremism, or hatred in our ranks. That was followed by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who put out, admittedly, a slightly milder statement, saying, "I stand with my fellow service chiefs in saying we are all always stronger together." Less blunt, but I think we know what he means. That was followed by the Chief of the National Guard, who spoke more directly. He said, quote, "I stand with my fellow Joint Chiefs in condemning racism, extremism, and hatred. Our diversity is our strength." Service chiefs in the military don't usually do this, let alone the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But tonight, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Joseph Dunford, said this to Voice of America.
And I can absolutely and unambiguously tell you that there's no place for racism and bigotry in the U.S. military or in the United States as a whole.
Or in the United States as a whole. The service chief, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, they stay apolitical. They stay out of domestic politics strictly, both stylistically and literally as a rule, they stay out of it. Uniformed military personnel are not allowed to be involved in partisan politics, and the military brass lives that ethos every day. That said, even when the civilian leadership of the U.S. government is making nice with and being complimentary to white supremacists, the military feels a need to separate. The military has its own very acute history on the subject and its own operational reasons to make clear that they're not following this president down that particular political path. Here's just one example. You might remember in April 2014, there was a multiple murder in Kansas, a domestic terrorist attack that targeted a Jewish community center and a Jewish retirement home in Overland Park, Kansas. This nutty old man who committed those murders was a committed, lifelong white supremacist and neo-Nazi. He shouted Heil Hitler after he was arrested. He acted as his own lawyer at his trial. He gave the Nazi salute in the courtroom after he was convicted. He said his only regret about the murders was that none of the people he actually killed turned out to be Jewish, even though he picked those locations for his attack in the hopes that he'd be singling out Jews to murder. At his trial, he unsuccessfully tried to introduce video evidence from his past leadership of a uniformed group of white supremacists in North Carolina. Turns out he'd been a founding member of the White Patriots Party in North Carolina in the 80s. Before that, it had been called the Confederate Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Before that, it had been the Carolina Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And they, in fact, wore military uniforms, and they marched in military formation. They did military-style training. They also freaked a lot of people out at the time by the fact that they seemed to have access to some military-grade weapons. One of the things that was most unsettling about those Klan groups and that White Patriots Party when it emerged, and they started doing all these marches and demonstrations in the 80s, is that their leader at the time, the guy who all those years later would end up shooting those people at a Jewish community center in Kansas, their leader back in the 80s when he was running the White Patriots Party in those Klan chapters, turns out he had built up his leadership skills, his organizational skills, his weapons training and military training, which he imbued to those Klan groups. He built it up while he served for 20 years in the United States Army. But the instructive thing to know about that now is that when the Army, even way back in the day, when the Army figured out what they were dealing with him, they kicked him out. He participated in the Greensboro Massacre in 1979. When Klan groups and Nazi groups ambushed a lefty march and rally in Greensboro, North Carolina. They murdered 5 people. He was in the National Socialist movement at the time. He was in the American, basically, Nazi Party at the time and attended that ambush. And the Army thereafter kicked him out for distributing racist propaganda after they found that he had participated in that event. The U.S. Army, all the branches of the military, have long had a policy of kicking people out if they find them to be part of racist or extremist groups or involved in racist or extremist organizing. Under Ronald Reagan in 1986, Secretary of Defense Cap Weinberger issued a special directive re-upping that principle for all branches of the military. September 1986, he sent out a priority message reminding all services that all military personnel duty-bound to uphold the Constitution must reject participation in supremacist organizations. A few years later, in 1990, 5 Air Force MPs were thrown out of the service for being Klan members. 1995, when they caught the guys who did the Oklahoma City bombing, it emerged that they had first met and made friends in the 1st Infantry Division at Fort Riley in Kansas. Partially in response to that, in 1996, the military re-upped and strengthened its anti-extremism regulations. Military personnel must reject participation in organizations that espouse supremacist causes. Quote, commanders have authority to employ the full range of administrative procedures, including separation or disciplinary action against military personnel who actively participate in such groups. Then in 2009, they re-upped it again. They clarified that you could be thrown out of the service for fundraising or demonstrating or rallying or recruiting or training or organizing or leading members of supremacist groups. You could be thrown out of the service for distributing racist materials. In 2012, they re-upped it again, making clear that you could be thrown out of the service, you could be prevented from joining the service. Not only if you actually do all of that active stuff to participate in racist groups, but even if you have a tattoo or a body marking that is associated with a racist or extremist group like that. The military literally now gives commanders an extremist tattoo decision support matrix. So you can get advice in figuring out whether that stupid winged dragon on your recruit's forearm is just a stupid winged dragon, or maybe it's a Nazi winged dragon. The U.S. military has as much of a white supremacist infection as the rest of American society. The difference between the U.S. military and the rest of us is that in the U.S. military, it's not just terrible to be a Nazi scumbag. In the U.S. military, it is illegal to be a Nazi scumbag. And they freaking police it. And it is crucial to U.S. military leadership, and it has been recognized for decades as crucial to military leadership, that the military is absolutely crystal clear on this subject. And so when the president, the commander-in-chief, starts blurring that line, then yes, the service chiefs of the U.S. military feel the need to jump in immediately to try to make that line clear again, to try to erase any confusion that anybody might have on that subject. As if they didn't already have enough on their plate before this, right? As if they didn't already have enough to deal with before this got shoveled onto their plates by the President of the United States. Got more ahead tonight. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.